Hey everybody, it's Chris here on a very special edition of The Process. I'm joined by two intellectual heavyweights from Art Center, highly regarded, highly respected, Allison Goodman and Petrula Vrontikis. Stick around. Let me try this again.
I want you guys to listen to me.
Yeah.
I design sandwiches. My name is Jose Caballero and I talk about the design of business. I talk about a lot of stuff.
My name is Chris Doe and I talk about the business of design.
At the center of this operating system, it's about understanding.
Jose, can we just tell them what the show title is?
I hate you, dude.
You are watching The Process. Thank you for joining us on our brand new set, you guys. I hope you guys appreciate that. And I want to give our audience a little context as to what we're talking about today. We were all sitting in a faculty meeting at Art Center, and some really meaty topic came up about authorship and originality. And mostly it was centered around the idea of plagiarism, some students borrowing work heavily and not crediting the person and not acknowledging that. And so I just wanted to get your thoughts on that and to continue that conversation.
Want to start?
I'll start
Okay.
by saying that I took it to the students. I took it to the classroom, and I had two different classrooms talk about it amongst themselves and with me. And one thing I found out is that they were equally concerned about plagiarism amongst themselves. So students taking ideas that had come up in the classroom and making them their own.
Oh, taking it from other students?
Yes.
Oh, that has happened.
And so that was a big issue for one of the classes in particular. And then the other conversation centered more around really wondering why students were pursuing an education at Art Center if it wasn't their intention to become their best, and if it wasn't their intentions to stretch and work hard. And they saw plagiarism as a lessening of the entire educational experience for everybody. I think that you're in school to do a lot of growing. I think you're supposed to challenge yourself. I think you're supposed to admit and discuss when you've hit a wall, and that the way around that wall, you don't go around it, you have to go over it, and you ask for help. You're in a very supportive environment. It's a good place to say, I'm stuck, I need help, and to come to that conclusion in a timely fashion, because that will help you for the rest of your life to know when you see a boundary that you can't push past. So I wish that was the discussion and not, oh, thank God this student came up with a good idea. If they didn't come up with it themselves.
I think we're in a pretty elite school where there isn't a lot of plagiarism, because I think students are really sharp and talented and feel supported. I think plagiarism tends to occur more when people feel that they don't have enough talent or enough time or enough resources, and it's a fear-based reaction. So we find it's really prevalent in our field, especially if people feel like they can't do it.
Well, maybe just for a minute we can take one step back and talk about, well, what constitutes plagiarism to you? Because I think the way, like, my ideas are not my own ideas. My ideas are from the things that I read, the people that I talk to, professors. They're not really my ideas. And it's a universe of ideas and design. Like, I didn't design Helvetica, but I use Helvetica. And I'm inspired by a lot of Swiss modern design. I really am. And when you say inspired, so then it becomes a matter of who's the judge, who's making this call, and what is influence and what is considered plagiarism. Maybe we can just talk about that before we kind of talk about how it's showing up in the classroom or not showing up in the classroom, as you were saying.
I think plagiarism is a blatant ripoff of someone's ideas and their visual language. And when people do it, I think they do it shamelessly sometimes. So the idea of it being influence or inspiration is maybe a vague aesthetic, but when there's plagiarism, it really, really is unmistakable. And it's...
How do you define it?
I define it as stealing someone's ideas and the method by which they put their ideas out there, their style, their tone, and their concept. I think there's more rip-offs of concepts than people talk about. Usually you can see when something's plagiarized because the the visual articulation is the same, but I think stealing someone's concepts and ideas just as bad.
If you were standing in front of a panel of jurors and instructed them on how to decide if this is plagiarism or not, what kind of parameters or guidelines can you put on it, or can you?
Well, to go back to the first question, I think it's about process and intention. And yes, we collect ideas, we research, we experience life, we bring together lots of ideas, and if we're willing to say, I looked at this typography, and I thought that would be appropriate, so I worked with it in the context of all these other things I'm bringing to the table, and you manifest it out of the conglomeration of all the things that you think are appropriate for that project, I think you are sparing yourself the agony of plagiarism. Because I mean, my question that I want to ask you, Chris, because I wrote this down before I came here, is what's the exit plan from plagiarism? How do you stop? How do you explain it? How do you not become the person who plagiarizes as a motif in your work? And so I think when you ask somebody, how are you going to stop doing this? The answer of what's plagiarism becomes clear. So I think it has to do with process. And we live in a world where lots of images are available. I sometimes wonder if Pinterest is just social media plagiarism, like making all these other ideas your idea. But we're accepting that. And so you go to Pinterest and you collect ideas. It's how you put them together. And I think that's where I would draw the line on judging plagiarism.
So you said a lot of things in there about intent.
Right.
What's your intent and the exit plan. I may be the weird person on this panel of three where I don't think there's anything as an original idea. I really firmly believe that. I'm a big fan of Magritte, his paintings.
Yeah.
And he does these surrealist paintings. And then the more I look at advertising, the more I see it's the same idea done over and over again.
Right.
There's I think 7 ideas in advertising, and I've cataloged them. Mm-hmm. You know, the juxtaposition, like the one thing that I'm talking about in very specific terms, there's a painting where Magritte has somebody at the beach and they're painting the same beach scene. So it's like a picture within a picture.
I love that.
All right?
His work.
And then I see an ad many years ago of somebody holding up a credit card of the way the house used to look before it burned down. And they hold it up there like, this is what this card does for you.
Right.
Same idea is happening over and over again.
I think advertising is especially bad in regards to plagiarism. I think, and I think it's because they can get away with it. And I think it's possibly because some of their clients aren't savvy enough to know what they're ripping off.
I think it's interesting that you brought up Magritte, because I cannot tell you how many times I have said, let's Google Magritte in the classroom to show a student that this idea of the collapsing of the frames of the foreground and background and of creating some sort of mystery is something that has been done. And if they're coming up with this idea, they should at least know who they are referencing, either intentionally or unintentionally. And so if you're going to do this, you need to know Magritte. Or if you're going
Go back to the source.
If you're going to do this, you need to understand like Il Journal by Picasso. You need to understand these seminal moments in modernism so that you understand where you're operating from. So I don't have any problem with nothing being an original idea. I do have a problem with people being ignorant of that they are utilizing these pathways that have been set up, or consciously failing to reference that they got an idea from somewhere. I think that's where plagiarism is. It's, can you admit that you looked at this magazine from the 50s, you got this idea, and you made it your own? I don't have a problem with that. I have a problem with ripping it off and not referencing the source.
And I think plagiarism is really about profiting somehow from someone else's work, whether it's meeting a deadline in school or you're selling an idea to a client. Because then it's not like influence. If you're learning the formal skills of sketching, or you may imitate, and imitate is part of the learning process. And it's important to understand how someone else has done something. If we could impart something on someone, it's like, okay, this feeling you have about needing to rip this off, think about what could happen. What if this does start to get awards and people start thinking it's yours? What if you sell it to a client and the actual originator sues the client? I mean, there are just so many ramifications to doing this. If you think those through at all, it won't be, it ceases to be the choice.
I think just from my point of view, that there's white and there's black, and to me there's a lot of gray in between. When I say, look at this design and I lay it out almost exactly the same way and I change a word, then that becomes, like, my intent is actually to be really lazy and sloppy as a designer, and I'm gonna get into trouble at some point. But if I look at this design and say it's really beautiful in its minimal approach, it's one font, it's a beautiful color, and I'm gonna typeset it, and somebody's like, well, you copied that. I'm like, well, I don't think so, because I don't think the idea of Helvetica or simple clean layouts is something that anybody owns. The universe owns that.
Well, and also people did four columns of small Helvetica for like 15 years.
Yeah.
Like without break. So yeah, you're not ripping anything off.
Right. So it's in the gray. When we,
Right.
I think when it's very blatant, we know, and it's the person's intent to be really lazy. But then there's this whole other thing, and I don't know if you guys are familiar with this film that was put out by a guy named Kirby Ferguson. And he put out a series of 3 films. It's called Everything is a Remix. And it's wonderful because he talks about it in a larger kind of pop culture art film context, that everything comes from something. And our art form, our society, our culture, our language moves forward because we borrow, and we should encourage borrowing heavily.
Brian Burton, aka Danger Mouse, takes the Beatles' White Album, combines it with Jay-Z's The Black Album to create the Gray Album. Now, the Gray Album is a remix. It is new media created from old media. It was made using these 3 techniques: copy, transform, and combine. That's how you remix. You take existing songs, you chop them up, you transform the pieces, you combine them back together again, you've got a new song, but that new song is clearly comprised of old songs. But I think these aren't just the components of remixing. I think these are the basic elements of all creativity. I think everything is a remix, and I think this is a better way to conceive of creativity.
And I'm sure you guys are familiar with that quote from Picasso where he says, good artists borrow, great artists steal. So I tell my students, steal away. So in my class, I encourage some form of plagiarism because I want them to learn. I don't want them to run away from a good idea because they'd seen it before. So instead they invent an original, dumb, ugly, stupid idea. Like, you can have that idea, you can own that, but nobody cares.
But you're giving them permission to do that.
I do. I
And
encourage
that's
it.
fine
Okay.
if that's the context.
Right, and there's another context to that, because sometimes in the classroom context at least, we're discussing something and I say, oh, that's great, you could maybe, and then I converse, and then the student shuts down. Oh, no, I can't do it because you said it. And I said, well, I would have never said it if you hadn't done 3 weeks of research, had all these ideas, and if we weren't discussing. So I totally think that the conversation with the culture at large, with the faculty, with your students is so important and should be where they cultivate ideas. And I don't think that looking at the world and getting ideas from the world and moving forward kind of as a group, as a conglomeration through these ideas of communication, I think that's great. I want them to be able to understand their process, and I want them to be able to discuss that so that if there are any problems, they can be hashed out.
There are a few generational issues, I think, too. If you are in school, you probably haven't gotten your work ripped off yet. And once you get out and people actually start stealing your work and start profiting from it, you really start understanding how painful this is.
Yeah.
And so sometimes,
It happens to us all the time.
yeah, I think especially with the millennial generation, there is a level of digital promiscuity that I think is rampant.
Hashtag digital promiscuity there.
Right.
And I have to say, that's not my term. That was, I heard it from Scott
It's okay,
Snibby.
it's totally okay.
And I'm not sure it is his,
Yeah.
but I think it's a great term, and I think it applies here, where everything's able to be ripped off. It's like, you know, it's the joy of the sharing culture, the sharing economy.
Yes.
So in that, it's something where people are remaking, remixing, and that remixing is different than just blatant, I found this, I'm giving it to you, I'm profiting from it.
Okay, let me ask you two guys if you can be judges in this case here. Star Wars, one of my favorite films, George Lucas, it's what he made his career on. And then people show that he literally cut World War II footage and basically reshot the same sequence. Is that plagiarism? Or is that remixing? Is that art? What is that? Are you guys familiar with what I'm talking about?
It? No, but it's...
No, he hasn't, and it was just revealed later on. I mean, his editors knew it because they did an edit with this footage because, you know, visual effects is very expensive. So in our industry, we call that pre-visualization.
Right.
You literally borrow clips from movies, music videos, anything, anywhere, nothing is sacred.
Right.
You cut it together to block out the idea. Because once you're on set, you need to know how long does that take, what are the camera angles, because if it doesn't work, you've wasted a lot of money. So is that plagiarism? I'm just curious.
I can't speak to it without understanding it a little bit more.
Are you familiar with Star Wars?
Yeah, but
Okay.
I'm not sure where his...
Well, like, you know, there's
his,
like the shot where Han Solo or Chewbacca's in the gun turret and they're shooting and it's going from left to right tracking. They have black and white footage of the exact same shot, same angle of a gunner in an airplane shooting like that and tracking along.
The original
Shot for
footage,
shot.
was that just documentary footage?
I think so.
So it depends on the owner of that. Who owns that? Who owns that? Because sometimes who made it is not the person who owns it.
Sure. So you're talking about ownership and copyright, that kind of stuff. But just in the idea of like, if a student had done that, would we get angry at them? Would we say, don't do that and admonish them for it? Or say, wow, I really like how you took that and transformed it and made it into this other thing?
Mostly when I see stuff that looks too close to the original work, I'll pretty much say, well, you, like Allison mentioned, you need to see this. You need to look at this more carefully. Because I would hate for anyone to think you plagiarized. You can't have anything in your portfolio that, I mean, maybe their generation doesn't recognize it, but our generation does. So, you know.
Or I would say, using Magritte as an influence in your portfolio, you would write, using Magritte as an influence, I pursued this idea. I do think it's, you know, that it's okay, and maybe Magritte would differ. But you know, there's the battleship Potemkin, Odessa step sequence that was reshot frame by frame for, oh goodness, Kevin Costner, Al Capone. What was that movie? Somebody help.
The Untouchables.
The Untouchables. It was an homage. So I think that if, and the battleship Potemkin, Odessa step sequence is one of the great moments where film changed. And I think that whoever did The Untouchables would say it was an homage and would admit it. So I think it matters if, who did Star Wars again? George Lucas. I wanted to say George Orwell, so you're really throwing me off here. But I think if George Lucas can say, yes, that is a seminal moment in film. That's when we understood how to put somebody in the seat of battle. And yes, I use that because it hasn't been improved upon.
So
but if he can't say it, if he's hiding in his poopy diaper in the corner, then we know he's ashamed.
But then the work is still the work. And the work is still appreciated and loved and beloved by millions of fans all over the world.
Right, and maybe people go back and watch
the
the World War II movie now.
They might.
I think that's fine. Again, as long as George Lucas, not Orwell, can say, yes, of course, this is what filmmaking is about. It's about pushing the craft forward.
So in the context of the classroom then, I give my students free permission and reign to steal from us, steal from anybody, and I encourage it because I want them to learn. I want them to try lots of ideas and not to get hung up on that.
You're teaching them formal skills, Chris.
Or am I?
Yes,
but are you saying they have to know where they stole it from and why?
No, I didn't even care.
That's what I would think is
I didn't even care. Because I'm going to push and we're going to learn so much when we move together. I don't need everybody to stop and put an asterisk and put a footnote on everything they're going to say and say, well, I got this from Magritte, I got this from Lucas, I got this from a Michael Bay film. Don't really care. And I personally, and I'm relating this to myself, as you can see, I have a very strong opinion on this, is that when I first started out in this industry, I was taking all my own photos, trying to comp all this stuff, and I would have 2 frames of one lame idea. I went over to a friend, he showed me 3 storyboards, complete ideas all mocked. I'm like, how did you produce so much and so fast? He's like, dude, I just went into our film library. I pulled these things together and I cut this thing and I changed the sequence so that it told the story I wanted to say. Well, I didn't make these frames. It's about telling a story. And that moment, my first reaction is like yours, you cheater, that's plagiarism, you're taking the shortcut to all of this. But then I realized what he was selling was the idea and not the crafting of the frame. And I'm big on this. I want to sell ideas to people. I don't want to sell making skills. I'm not about the craft at this point. So when the clients buy off on his idea, he goes back. He hires a storyboard artist. They work it out. They figure out the timing, the framing, art direction, wardrobe, lighting direction. There's a lot of stuff that goes on.
What you're asking your students to do is really step back and observe this process. And I think it's incredibly valuable because I think it encourages them to play within this and find out what they have in it. So it pushes them past the idea of rip-off into the idea of influencing and looking at this thing in a more 360-degree view and coming back at it in their own.
Right.
So I think
Eventually
actually what you're
that
doing
storyboard, yeah.
encourages them to be observant and
Right.
get to where they need to be faster. So I'm totally
Yeah, but
down with
I
what
would
you're doing.
add that if you say, that's a great sequence, how did you come to that? Then they should be able to say, a little Michael Bay, a little Star Wars.
I also know this because when I ask my students to look at a frame, we actually do something called a master copy. I assign them a frame, and it's usually an amazingly beautiful, like crafted frame. Somebody spent hours, days working on that frame. I said, I need you to copy that. Copy it as close as you can without using any of the elements from the original shot. And they have a hard time doing that. Not because they don't want to, because the technical skills that are required. So inevitably through the process of making it, it changes. It can't be a pixel for pixel copy. It's not trying to stand in as a forgery. It's not. And so it automatically changes, and that's what happens. So I never worry about them actually being able to rip it off because people have so many resources in the real world. Cinematographers, lighting people, visual effects, typographers, and all these people collaborating to make this thing that you don't have those same tools. So you're gonna get close, but you're never gonna get that thing, and that's okay. So for me, when it comes to plagiarism, all it comes down is to intent, like the credit and all that kind of stuff, because when you show your work, you don't have the ability to stand there all the time and give this lengthy description about where everything comes from, sourcing and citing all of your sources, right? So it's about intent. And without crawling and inhabiting a person's brain, I don't know what their intent is. It's impossible for me to determine, so I just move beyond that. I just want to see, is the work good? Is it interesting? And if you copy something, did you improve upon it or not? Don't make it a worse copy, make it a better copy.
And Allison's saying, and I think we all agree, that knowing what you're doing and being able to say, I referenced this artist, I referenced this designer, I was especially interested in this, and I mashed it up and then gave it this of mine, and therefore it has come out looking different, but the influences are there. So, yeah, these are gray areas, but areas that are not gray areas are areas like the issue with Shepard Fairey and the Obama poster.
Let's talk about that. Ooh, I'm glad you brought that up. It's on my thing of
And Modern
controversial
Dog.
things. Let's talk about Shepard Fairey.
Okay.
Okay? Plagiarism or not plagiarism?
Absolutely plagiarism. He admitted it on stage at Art Center when I had him at a 3x3.
I'm not sure it was plagiarism. I think it might have been failure to appropriately license that image. Because to me,
Oh, about the Obama thing? I'm sorry, let me clarify. I'm talking about his whole art life, his whole style. Forget about the Obama poster. That was
okay.
super duper clear.
okay.
He took an AP press photo and then
Yeah,
he
and he
redrew
didn't-
it.
right.
That's fine. That's he got sued and he went through court and all
Right.
that. I'm talking about his whole freaking career, his whole art style. All right.
Right.
Let's step there. Is that plagiarism or not plagiarism?
I don't think it's plagiarism. I don't think his whole art style is plagiarism.
I'll go with it.
But the threshold thing, I'm telling you, once you start doing this and appropriating, it, in his mind, probably that Obama poster didn't seem like such a bad idea. So he's pushing it so close and maybe getting so easily able to see that this is not as clear, and that probably led him to easily do that without thinking of the ramifications of it.
Allison? Plagiarism, not plagiarism?
Absolutely not. That was his thing, was about reproduction and taking things that meant one thing, like the Obey and Andre the Giant, and turning them into something else.
Do you know where all that stuff came from? Are you guys familiar with his whole career and his whole thing? He watched a film with Rodney Rowdy Piper. Horrible film in the 80s.
I know, but it's so famous.
Okay. It is very famous. It's like a weird cult film, right? And all his ideas, including the word obey, comes from that film. Because in the film, there are aliens living among us, and they have propaganda. And with these special sunglasses, you can see the propaganda in plain sight, like on billboards and TV commercials. And so all the idea of the word obey comes from that film. And it comes straight from that film. And then he takes this art style that is heavily borrowed or influenced by Russian constructivists. And you can see the compositions, the everything, the color palette. You and I know this. Anybody who's been to art school and taken an art history class or design history class knows exactly where that comes from. So he makes his career, and now he was pushed from being a commercial artist into becoming a fine artist. But it's all on this one shtick that he borrowed heavily.
He is an artist, and he takes his risks, and he rolls with those risks, and the public domain and art is a different expression. But rather take it back to the classroom, where I think we're saying to our students, what kinds of decisions are you making, and how are you learning to be the citizen of design that you want to be, whatever that constitutes? And can you talk about the why in your work, not the what? Because I think that's what you're talking about. You're saying, I don't care what frame you use, you need to make sure it's there for a reason. And when I ask you why that frame is there, I want you to have an answer. And so I think if we take this back to the classroom, we talk about why instead of what, and we talk about developing as a thinker, developing as an executioner, wrong word, as somebody who executes great thoughts, I think we're fine. And if you can talk about your work intelligently, and I think Shepard Fairey can talk about his work intelligently, and if he wants to get sued, he gets sued, you know. I don't think it's a risk for him. I think he's different. I think he's positioned differently.
But if you looked at his life and his work and his career in real time, where does it go from copyright infringement, plagiarism, into you're an artist, welcome to the world? And what are we telling our students and the public at large? It's like, do as I, not as I do. You know, like if we say we respect him now and his paintings are worth a lot of money now, I believe, he built that up on borrowing heavily from other work, heavily.
What do you think?
I'm gonna hold off on what I think until I hear Petrula chime in on
No,
that.
I'm with Allison on this one. It's difficult to talk about in the art world because even though we're creative, we're not in the art world. And there's a lot of stuff that goes on in the art world that is, you know, we could be having a completely different
So you don't like
conversation
advertising,
about.
you don't like art?
No, I don't. Advertising is, I think in advertising, it is a problem because I think companies are unaware that they are spending millions of dollars on unoriginal ideas. And that, I think, is a problem. If somebody wants to buy a Shepard Fairey painting for $1 million, good for them. They can talk about it however they want. He's not, but to sell, when companies hire designers and art directors and creative directors to come up with really good original ideas and spend a lot of money on it, they deserve really good original ideas.
Well, I guess then my challenge would be, and we can't do this because it's not an interactive forum, is show me an original idea. And that's just more rhetorical than anything else.
It sounds so weird, but I don't know whether it was you or Allison.
I've never seen an original idea.
What one of you said was lazy, to actually put up something that is lazy and reappropriating something and not understanding its origin, not understanding its real relationship to why it existed in the first place, being very just desperate, low-hanging fruit. I'm just going to grab this thing.
Right.
That's the issue. And in some instances, the reappropriation is really, really interesting and more interesting than the original.
Right. And I'm also going to say, Chris, that I think you're barking up the wrong tree with Shepard Fairey. I think, yeah, I think it's low-hanging fruit, to use Petrula's term. And I think that, I'm going to take it back to the classroom, because if a student says, oh, Shepard Fairey did it, and they come in with like obey, and there's a, object translation of some other wrestler, for the obey Andre the Giant sticker, I'm like, oh, you're ripping off Shepard Fairey, but do what he did, but do it better and do it in your own way. And then you can have a discussion with the world at large as to whether or not you're being valid. So I think that the danger with students is they look at Shepard Fairey and they think that the clue is do what Shepard Fairey did.
What did he do?
No, they're going to make art that is formally
like him,
what he did.
But not the process.
But not the process. And I think if they look at the process, they're actually engaging in an intellectual endeavor that's worth investigating. And like with the master frame, your story, hopefully they come up with something better.
I would just like for them to come up with something as good, because these are heavyweight industry titans doing these frames, right? And what's amazing to me, and this is totally like a sidebar here, what is amazing for me to see is when I assign them the frame, their first reaction is total intimidation and fear.
Right.
They look at this thing like, I can't make that. I can never make that. And then guess what? In 2 weeks, they lecture and teach everybody else how to make that thing. So I'm way like strange in this way, I think, where I'm very pragmatic. I want people to learn. I want people to learn that there's only so many ideas in the universe, and to take them all and use them all and keep remixing it and grow. And then you might start out as a person who plagiarizes work, but if you keep at it and you keep grinding away at it, you're going to be this amazing creative force, versus being that person who's like, oh, I can't borrow that, I can't. It's just like, I think you're just being ignorant. And I would have this debate back when I was at Art Center.
But can you come up with a different word than plagiarize?
Well, that's the word that we're bandying about.
No, but I think for in the classroom, I think that the conversation might want to separate itself from the legal definition and the connotations that surround that word.
You're asking them to do a form of research, not necessarily plagiarize. In your class, with this assignment, you're asking them to deeply research and understand. So I don't think that's the same as plagiarize.
And do a master-student kind of learning. The master being the master frame, but that's just
to be influenced by the research that you do, and to experiment within the parameters of that assignment. Not plagiarism.
Right.
Plagiarism is more blatant, it's a rip-off, and it's sold.
Yeah, and it's tail between the legs, and it's out of fear, which you said earlier, and it's
desperation.
Desperation, and it doesn't have a context. And I think that's why it's so hard to suss out in the classroom.
So here's my belief, here's my thought, and just totally pulling this out of my butt, is let's say like Stephen Heller, he writes a ton of books on design and design history. Right. I'm going to imagine that he's got a pretty deep knowledge of design and art history. So let's say we brought him into the classroom. He could cite every source of every idea and everything, and then the whole school is a ripoff, including the teachers.
Well, he did that.
Do you know what I mean?
In his book with Mirko Ilić called Anatomy of Design, he actually goes back and speaks about influence. So even though some modern designers, say it's Stefan Sagmeister, puts together some kind of original idea, he's able to track back and say, oh, this body painting, this body tattoo, it started here, and that handwritten typography on the face goes there. So he'll track all of this back, and it's really, really interesting. It's a great study. Mm-hmm. Is Sagmeister ripping people off? No, I don't believe so. I think he gets influenced by what he sees. I think he has an incredible, amazing library of articulations that he uses in his work. But I don't. Is he influenced? Yes. Does he plagiarize? No.
And I also think.
Did he give credit? Was that his intent?
I would imagine that if you had a conversation with him, he'd probably know where a lot of that stuff came from.
So if you're ignorant of where the source is, then you can't plagiarize because you just made it up. And somebody else with more knowledge than you can backtrack it, right? Because if I grow up and from an infant, grow up in a white room with no external stimulation, I may make work that's original to me, but not original to the world. And that's why I'm so fired up about this. Like, I don't really care. I just don't care. I just want to get things done.
But I have a question. If you don't care, then why are you forcing us to give you a definition?
because I want to encourage the dialogue, because somewhere in the
Right.
audience, somebody out there in the universe, a teacher's going to hear one of our 3 opinions
Right.
and say like, that's what I
That's
believe.
what I wanna do.
And this is the conversation we want to
Right.
have. Or maybe I've been thinking about this in the wrong way my entire life.
Right. Well, then what I would say is that perhaps the takeaway is that there are many approaches to this. But again, I'm going to go with the classroom model. It's what's going to make this person a better designer, what's going to give them energy for a lifetime of practice, and what is something that they feel good about constructing. Because that's what's going to energize a career. And so if it's okay as long as you know why it's okay.
I'm going to come at this a different way. Most of the situations that younger designers are going to find themselves in the future are more collaborative than solo. In the past, there's been these solo endeavors where someone is just supposed to have this magic wand and they come up with amazing ideas all on their own, you know, behind their computer screen.
Right.
So this is not how the world's going to be that we're coming up with, that they're coming into now. So in these collaborative teams, I think it's going to be much more interesting, the mashup and the originality that's going to come from the influence. I think there will be less plagiarism, and there will be more interesting outgrowths of inspiration from many sources. And I think they'll keep each other in check in the same way that Allison's talking about her classroom keeping them in check. I don't think a group of 6 designers is going to blatantly rip off something that they've seen that got an award in some art directors club piece. They're just not going to let that happen. So I think plagiarism is more dangerous for them. So to have as some kind of fallback position, or what I'll call up against the wall position, that place where you feel like you don't have a choice and what you do when you feel desperate.
Right.
So I think they've got to be careful of it even more, because their collaborative teams will reject them as a team member if they just come in and say, I thought of this, and then they're going, oh, you know, that.
There's 2 intellectuals who've discussed this, so I want to credit them for.
And those aren't us.
No.
I was like, what does that make me? Chopped liver?
Not
Like-
in this room.
And then
No,
one
you're
imbecile.
intellectual. It's like historical.
One mental midget and 2 intellectuals have a conversation. That's how we're going to open this
Right.
whole show.
I'm going to redo the eye roll so that you can put that close up of that one.
All right, the 2
No,
intellectuals, please.
Intellectual giants that came way before us. So Walter Benjamin, Art in the Age of Mechanical Reproduction, said that everything we do is an imitation of the format that came before us, and it takes a moment in time to push it forward. So for instance, movies originally imitated theater with kind of the frame as the person sitting still and people coming in and out. And until the Odessa step sequence and the camera was moving, that didn't change. And then, but things changed. So I think this idea of using what came before us is part of waiting for the moment where things turn over. And things are turning over so rapidly in our digital age that I think we need to understand where we're practicing. So that's one thing.
What does that mean? Understand where we're practicing?
Am I relying on what has come before and putting it together in new ways, and referencing and reflecting and being part of the production of good work, but not that's pushing definitions forward? Or I have a moment, you know, and I all of a sudden could push things forward, but that makes you a historical anomaly. But they're essential. They're essential. So I forget. I'm really bad with names. The photo of the gentleman in France jumping over the puddle.
Muybridge, the
No,
photographer.
He's another person who changed the way we look. But this was a French gentleman, another one who I'll get it later, and you can put it in. But that changed photography forever. It no longer resembled painting. Jumping over the puddle. We'll find it.
Okay.
The other one is John Kenneth Galbraith in The New Industrial State. And he basically said that everything that was going to be invented was invented already, and that we're just left with iterations. Now, of course, he stopped.
I like that.
Yeah, he stopped before digital, but digital was a new. But at some point, I think his example is toothpaste was new. And now we're just left to add minty sprinkles and put it in a pump or change the cap design, but essentially toothpaste hasn't changed. Right. And I think we just need to accept the fact that we operate in a field of a lot of sameness, and then all of a sudden it jumps.
Right. Now, sitting next to two intellectuals, this
oh my God.
This mental midget
as I am too.
Has a string
right.
of thoughts in reaction to a bunch of things that you said. And then I want to get us into final thoughts on this, and then our next topic, okay?
Next topic.
We have another topic.
Oh, okay.
We have another topic here. All right. Which is about if somebody made me king of design, I would ban the word plagiarism. I don't believe in it. Everything comes from something. I want to embrace it. And I'll tell you why, because I believe in progress. Yeah. I believe in progress because one of the things is I just struggle with my students just being able to articulate their ideas and to make good work, period. That's just difficult enough in itself. Then to worry about, like, I got to credit this person and all these kinds of things, because one of the things, especially in the classroom and in the office here, where our ability to do this means we eat or we don't eat, is I say, let's not reinvent the wheel. I don't want them to recreate and relearn something that's already been resolved. Like when we set up the cameras here, we have a 3-camera setup. I did not invent that.
No,
right?
I think that was
I want them to research. I want them to research and figure it out, because we don't want them to go backwards. We stand on the shoulders of giants. That's how progress is made in medicine and technology and art and everything. So now why is design this exception? I think about the story about Steve Jobs visiting the Palo Alto Xerox lab, right, where they invented the future. They were just too dumb to capitalize on it. Let's just say that. They're geniuses, but whatever corporate interest couldn't see the practicality of it. He goes and sees the first GUI computer, graphic user interface. He goes back and is like, I got a new idea, you guys. Let's launch. Visionary, most valuable company in the world. Everything comes from something, and we keep building. It's like to sit there and like, man, you come from this. Just do it better. Just add to the conversation. That's all. Now, in relationship to the idea of collaboration, you said now, once you get out into the real world, unlike when you're in school, it's a solo endeavor, you work with teams. Now, what we're doing is in class, we're saying, Mary came up with an idea, wall that idea off. Build a trench around it, because you're not allowed to touch that idea. You need to come up with something else. So I found when I got out of school and I worked with other people, like I can't participate in the brainstorming session because I think that's your idea. So I'm training people now in class, right? If I do the opposite, which is, I don't know how to collaborate. It's Allison's idea, it's Petrula's idea. I want to contribute. Can I say what you said and add one new idea or reframe it? And then everybody's like, that's the genius part. And that's really about collaboration and progress, and I'm a pragmatist, and that's what I want. I want people to grow and learn and move, because at some point they'll figure it out. Now, I'm not going to address the black and white. It's so clear that you're just one lazy person, and that's all you're doing. It's a bad idea, a poor copy. I'm insulted always, from the thinking to the execution. The last little thought, just to clear it up, Shepard Fairey. Shepard Fairey, I'm gonna weigh in on this. Now, when I was less informed, I was like, what this guy's getting credit for all this stuff. But I don't even care. I'm thrilled for Shepard to be a fine artist, to be exhibiting, and to enjoy this wonderful career as an artist. I wish that for all my students and all designers, to be valued for what it is that you make. Whatever he puts his name on and whatever he touches, even if he doesn't touch it, it becomes valuable. So I don't care how he got there, and only time allows us to forgive that, because when he first started, he never mentioned anything about this kind of stuff. It's only after the fact that people pointed it out, like, I know where you got your stuff from, dude. Then it's kind of like a little revisionist history. Then he goes and changes the story, but I don't even care. Just make something good that the world enjoys and appreciates and make it a little bit better, that's all. Final thoughts?
I'm just going to go back. The question is how to inspire students to find that balance and to do the good work that you want them to do. And also to realize that their moment of reinvention, true pushing forward, might happen after school. Might. We're all growing. Right. And that they need to gain the tools to be ready for that moment. And so I think that's a kind of a strength, and the idea of investigation and the idea of knowing your work. And I don't think that it's a burden to know where you got things from. It's probably boring to enumerate that in a presentation, but I still think it's important. And that might be where I disagree with you just a bit.
I feel the same way that Allison does. What I think is interesting is the conversation, the articulation. I think because the origin of this is a desperation. I think it's extremely important to know why people do it in order to understand it. And that level of lack of time, talent, or resources, or just laziness, is what makes it plagiarism. Because they just said, I can't, there it is, that's it, sold, done. My fear is gone now.
We'll end it on that. And what I want to do now is segue into the other topic that came up right after the whole idea of plagiarism came up, which I forget who brought this up.
Me, it was me.
It was you?
Yeah.
Who had said, some of our students are hiring other students, and that's a problem. And that's a problem. So let's talk about this. Now I'm just going to get into a little bit of authorship.